Okay, so this morning we're going to kick off with Tom. So Tom Fenton is actually based fairly near here in Malvern. He's the CEO of Veritherm, part of the Red Barn Group. They've worked for some time, as he'll tell you, in environment and sustainability and energy efficiency, particularly on projects particularly around Herefordshire and Worcestershire, and now expanding further. And also Veritherm is one of the cohort at the Beta Accelerator here in Worcestershire. So he's in the process of accelerating the technology that they've been developing and taking it more rapidly to market. So Tom, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Yep, so thank you very much, Adrian, for the introduction. So as you've alluded to today, I'm going to speak a bit about energy assessment, specifically in buildings, and something that's known as the performance gap, which I will explain in some depth later on in the presentation. But firstly, a quick introduction. So my name is Tom Fenton, co-founder and CEO of Malvern-based technology startup Veritherm. I have a background in construction, specifically looking at building performance. And over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been heavily involved in net zero and low carbon building developments. So the term net zero is thrown around quite frequently now in the construction and building sector. And the reason for that is as a result of the Paris Agreement. So most of you have probably heard of the Paris Agreement. So it's our effort to limit global warming by a maximum of 1.5 degrees. Now, specifically in the construction sector, what we're aiming to do is reach a net zero target by the year 2050. Now, net zero means that buildings will not emit any CO2 emissions. And if they do, they'll be balanced by carbon removal. So an example of that, you may have seen Lewis Hamilton planting lots of trees to offset against his Formula One career. So that's what the term net zero actually means, and that's what we're striving for within our industry. But why do we need to focus on net zero, and why is the construction sector so important when it comes to sustainability? Well, currently CO2 emissions from buildings account for 1/3 of global emissions. So without the construction adopting new technologies and processes, it will seriously affect our ability to have a lower carbon, more energy efficient future. So I'm now going to move on to the term low carbon buildings, because that's what we're actually striving for. Low carbon buildings can be newly constructed homes or offices or spaces, or alternatively, it can be looking at upgrading our existing estate. So 90% of the buildings that will exist in the year 2050 are already here. So there's a huge amount of effort that's required to upgrade our existing estate, whilst also producing new buildings that are fit for purpose. Now, in my opinion, there's 2 key elements to a low carbon building. First being to maximize its energy efficiency. And the best approach to do this is by using a fabric first approach. You may have heard of passive house developments. This takes a similar approach. And what this means is that we adequately insulate our building envelopes, the exterior element of our building, so it is fuel efficient and has the ability to retain energy as it becomes operational. The other key element is to transition from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. Now, this second item was outlined as the most difficult policy in the government's clean growth strategy, which is the blueprint for our lower carbon, more efficient future. So those 2 points on the face of it look very straightforward. But in my opinion, there's some barriers to low carbon innovation in construction that is affecting progression. So on the right-hand side here, I've outlined 3 key items that I think is affecting the way that we work. Firstly, to upgrade our existing estate and also deliver high-quality, low-carbon assets in the new build space is going to cost us an astronomical amount of money. There's also some question marks around the technology that's currently available and whether we're actually in a position to roll this out on a large scale. And the final thing that I think is personally affecting low carbon buildings is the culture that we currently have within the construction industry. There's a reluctance to adopt change and adopt new methods. So until those 3 items align, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to actually roll this out across the UK and overseas. But aside from those 3 items, in my opinion, there's one key underlying problem, which is the performance gap. Now, if you haven't heard of the performance gap before, it's the disparity between predicted and actual carbon emissions and energy use in buildings. So I use this analogy all the time to explain it in quite a simple format. On the left here, we have a typical family vehicle. In the middle, we have a coffee machine. And on the right, we have an American-style refrigerator. Now, all of these consumer items are physically tested before you purchase them to ensure they don't emit any more pollutants or consume any more energy than originally intended. Now, the bizarre and questionable part of this presentation is that the construction sector and the building sector doesn't take the same approach with regards to energy performance. So a newly constructed or refurbished building is given a specific energy rating, but it's never actually tested at the point of handover before it becomes operational to ensure that that energy rating has actually been achieved in practice. Now, you might recognize this chap here, but the current way that we work in our sector is that you'll have a surveyor or an assessor come round with a clipboard and give your building an energy rating and an EPC certificate. Now, this fundamental flaw in the process is actually creating the performance gap, which is currently between 200 and 300%. So that is such a huge gap between intended and actual energy performance. This means that our buildings are emitting 2 to 3 times more carbon, as well as costing us 2 to 3 times more in energy bills. Now, unlike a car or a refrigerator or a coffee machine, buildings have a life expectancy of around 150 years, meaning that this is leaving a legacy that is damaging for our environment. It's undermining our ambition to become carbon neutral, and it's also costing us a huge amount of money in the process. So I've created a small infographic here, very basic, but it will give you some insight in the stark reality of our current situation. So down here at the bottom, the grey house is the performance of where buildings need to be in the year 2050. So not too far away in the grand scheme of things. For new and refurbished properties, this greenhouse here is where our current EPC estimates stand. But with regards to building performance and emissions, we're actually somewhere around here with the in the blue section. So we've got a long way to come if we're actually going to achieve this 2050 target, and the building sector needs to play a vital role to ensure that we can progress sustainably. So what's the solution? Well, we've developed a technology called Veritherm. So Veritherm's a 12-hour physical test that can be carried out after completion of a new build or refurbishment property. And what Veritherm can do is it can give the owner, the occupier, the stakeholder insight into real-world performance of that asset. So Veritherm can give the building a rating similar to a miles per gallon rating on a car, so that you can truly understand return on investment, give the asset an accurate efficiency rating, quantify the cost and carbon impact of that property. But if the property is underperforming, the solution is intelligent enough to explain or give you indication as to where the problems might be, i.e. what room is leaky or what room is underperforming. And you can do that by picking apart the raw data that we collect. So these are just some snapshots of the hardware which we use to carry out a Veritherm test. So what we do is we deploy an array of IoT smart sensors in the property, typically one per room. We also measure the external conditions. We then heat the building up for around about 5 hours and allow it to cool overnight. And our cloud-based platform then processes that data, runs it through some unique and patented algorithms that we've developed with some partners in Cambridge. And we can actually give the user a real-world insight into fuel economy and carbon impact. Now, our product has been endorsed by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and they've stated that Veritherm could help to reduce CO2 emissions from homes, reduce occupant bills, and to the UK meeting its carbon budgets, more importantly. There's lots of cost and environmental impact with regards to building performance and the performance gap specifically. However, there's some wider social impacts with regards to building performance and quality of build. Now, 1 in 9 homes in the European Union can't keep their homes adequately warm, which is creating huge health implications. And if we do not rectify the problem, then it's going to have long-term impact on people's lives, as well as the environment and as well as the cost as well. So we need healthier places to live and work, which is a key message that we like to put across as well. So the performance gap and building performance doesn't just stop at the housing sector. So we're now looking across the construction supply chain and are seeing lots of different pockets and areas where the problem needs to be addressed. Specifically, internal conditions that need to be temperature controlled 365 days of the year. So the cold chain sector is under a huge amount of stress and strain at the minute as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic with regards to food storage and transport, as well as pharmaceuticals. And currently 25% of the UK's fruit and veg supply is actually wasted because of inadequate cold storage installations. So our buildings are actually affecting our ability to deliver things like food and medicine. There's also innovative approaches to farming, such as vertical farming, which create bespoke internal environments to grow crops. However, it's very energy intensive and fuel hungry. You know, a typical farm would use 176 kilowatts an hour per just 1 kilogram of produce, meaning that when these sectors need to transition to low carbon sources of energy, there's possibly going to be a greater demand than the low carbon energy network can actually cope with. And finally, something like a data center. So data centers are growing and they're everywhere in most counties, but a very large data center in the UK can cost the operator in the region of £3 million a year in electricity alone, just to create the correct environment. Now, if this data center is housed within a building that is underperforming by 200 to 300%, then not only is it going to be hugely damaging for our environment, but it's also going to affect our ability to transition away from fossil fuels. So I truly believe that our Veritherm technology can play a huge part in transforming energy assessment in buildings. I think we have a long way to go with regards to the performance gap and closing that gap between intended energy emissions and actual energy emissions. But I truly believe we need to reform measurement, monitoring, metrics and certification to reflect real world building performance over and above model data, which is currently what the EPC scenario is based on. And a mantra that I quite like to use is what can't be measured can't be managed, and that is certainly true with regards to energy efficiency in buildings. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope it's given you some insight into the performance gap in buildings and also what role the construction sector has to play with regards to our sustainable future. Please, if you would like to chat more or talk about our technology or the performance gap, then get in touch, connect with me via LinkedIn or send me an email or visit our website. But I'm quite happy to take any questions that any of you may have.
Yeah, thank you ever so much, Tom. Really interesting.
You.
So we are now live on Facebook as well. Whilst you were talking, I solved the technical issue, but unfortunately we did miss obviously the first part. If people are watching on Facebook, the first part of that, but we are also recording. So thank you very much. I have asked people to ask questions. We've got a few attendees on the Zoom. They're very welcome to post some questions, or they can raise their hand and ask the question verbally, and I can allow them to talk. So don't be shy, attendees. It would be good to have some interaction. In the meantime, a question from me. I mean, the performance gap you outlined was quite shocking, actually. I just wondered, is that something that you see in other countries? Are other countries a bit stricter with some of their building regulations or expectations? Is it just the UK that you've identified this problem in?
No, so this is a widely recognised problem here in the UK and overseas. I think our ability to collect long-term data and usage is slightly better than some other areas, which has allowed us to quantify the impact slightly better than maybe some other territories. But certainly in the Middle East, Australasia, the States and mainland Europe, the performance gap is becoming a widely recognised term that certainly needs to be addressed.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and Penelope's very kindly asked a question. Thank you, Penelope. Are you able to measure this for old listed buildings?
Yes, we are. We specifically have a USP where we are measuring the performance of the asset before it's handed over. What we've done with existing buildings is we can almost do a before and after test. A listed building, through experience, is normally pretty poor with regards to its efficiency. So how much useful data you're going to get out of that test is questionable. It would actually be more beneficial to upgrade or insulate the property and then ensure that that installation has actually given you the return on investment that you require to make that commitment to upgrading your building. So whether you're going to introduce loft insulation, double glazing, cavity wall insulation, that's the point in which I would recommend measuring the performance of your building.
Okay, well, we've got just a couple of more minutes if anybody does want to ask a question. Tom, unfortunately, can't stay until the panel's more discussion at the end because he's actually, which is a good thing, has got to go off and demonstrate this technology he's just been talking about to potential customers. So we don't want to stop that from happening. There is a question from Mark. So we have had a similar performance gap in the world of vehicles to do with emissions of air pollutants from vehicles. Do you know what the cause of the building CO2 performance gap is?
So there's a huge amount of research that has gone into why the performance gap exists. It starts off at the design stage, where we can manipulate figures to kind of achieve certain values that we wish we could attain. But a lot of it comes down to actually the build part of or the refurbishment part of the project. So there's a term that's used in the construction sector, which is called value engineering, which has been kind of changed slightly. So the replacement of specified materials for cheaper or inferior or inadequate materials has really impacted the performance of some assets. There's also things such as cold bridging, poor workmanship, inadequate junction details around windows and doors. So there's a huge amount of problem with regards to installs that is affecting the way our buildings perform. So the energy rating is actually based on an idealized build, but in most cases, builders shortcut and create problems that are long term.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much. We're bang on time. That was a really interesting presentation, and certainly looking forward to watching how the technology progresses, certainly through the Beta Den cohort that we're both involved with. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much,
yes.
Tom.
Thanks,
nice
Adrian.
to see you, and see you again
everybody.
soon.
Thank you.